Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us to talk about the FCC and the First Amendment and that ABC lawsuit is John Bergmayer. He's legal director at Public Knowledge. John, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So talk about Public Knowledge and how's it funded?
We're a Washington, D.C. based consumer rights organization. We do a lot of work in the tech and telecom space and intellectual property and also the First Amendment. And we're funded by a mix of primarily foundations, but also individual sponsors and corporate support.
So in layman's terms, what is this lawsuit about? What is Disney alleging and what is it asking the courts to do?
Right. So FCC Chairman Brendan Carr called in Disney, ABC's, 8 owned and operated stations for early license renewal the day after President Trump called for Jimmy Kimmel to be fired. What I think is a pretext is that these stations are being investigated for DEI purposes for their employment practices. But it's really, President Trump has been complaining about ABC's coverage of him for many, many years. It really kicked off after the 2024 presidential debate, demanding that its licenses be revoked. That process is underway. Their licenses are under review at the FCC, and they sued saying, look, this investigation by itself is a violation of the First Amendment. It's undertaken to retaliate against our political speech, so they're asking the court to stop it.
So when you say that they're saying that it's because of DEI employment practices, that's a valid reason to review licenses on the FCC's part, if that was true. ABC is alleging that that's not true, but if that was?
The FCC does have authority over the employment practices of actual individual broadcast licensees, the 8 stations. The FCC's investigation went far beyond that to the Disney Corporation as a whole, which they do not have authority over. And they haven't even found any specific wrongdoing. They're just saying that the company wasn't forthcoming enough in its responses, which if you look at the complaint about the thousands upon thousands of pages that Disney has produced to the FCC so far, it really strains my credibility. And even after this license renewal proceeding began, they're continuing to ask Disney to produce more documents showing that the license renewal has nothing to do and is not necessary for this investigation.
So if this license review would go forward, how long would it take? And could it result in ABC completely going off the air?
So there are about 250 ABC stations nationwide, and the majority of them are independently owned, or they're owned by broadcast groups like Sinclair and not owned by ABC directly. But these 8 stations that Disney itself owns and operates in several major markets, they are under threat, yes.
So how do figures like Jimmy Kimmel play into this as is he part of this lawsuit? Because there was that whole situation of him going off the air for a while and then coming back after criticizing President Trump.
Yeah, I believe that it's tied directly to this investigation. ABC has provided a very helpful timeline of the events of President Trump and Carr threatening Disney and threatening to revoke its licenses. And of course, President Trump's ire is not only directed at ABC. There's lots of other media organizations that have come under threat, but ABC seems to be a particular target. And when you look at the timeline, the public complaints, the statements to the press, the threats, the innuendo, they're all about coverage. It's about The View, it's about Jimmy Kimmel, it's about George Stephanopoulos, and the DEI investigation, to the extent that it even is valid, which I would contest, is being used improperly as a vehicle as retribution for political speech.
If you've got a question about this topic for our guest, John Bergmayer, please start calling in now. Republicans are on 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. Let's hear from FCC Chairman Brendan Carr. He was on an interview with Politico, and he talked about what led his organization to call for this early review.
They've been going through rounds of discovery in our versions of subpoena with Disney. And frankly, the view here within the agency was that Disney was being non-responsive, their responses were deficient, that they were being disingenuous, and we had been telling them for weeks and months that if they didn't start producing in that discovery process responsive information, that we were going to go to the next step, which was to call their license in for early renewal. So The idea of bringing their license in for early renewal did not spring from any specific episode, and the timing of it was driven based on where we were in the discovery process. And it wasn't the first one that we did.
Did you get a call or talk to the president either before or after you made that announcement?
Look, as a general matter, we don't get into sort of any discussions that happen with the White House or don't happen with the White House. But on this one, we've been very clear. The process here was put in place. Our decision to move forward was based on where we were in discovery with Disney based on their non-responsiveness.
What do you make of that?
Well, I just don't think the timeline backs it up. It was on April 27th that President Trump posted on Truth Social, wow, Jimmy Kimmel, who is in no way funny, as attested to by his terrible television ratings, and went on, complaining about the joke that Jimmy Kimmel made about the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And the very next day is when the licenses were pulled in. And then the continued public statements from Trump and Carr were all about not DEI, but about the political coverage of President Trump. And I don't know what he means by them not being responsive when they produce thousands of documents. Maybe he's upset that they haven't found any evidence of wrongdoing.
Well, here is what this is a portion of ABC's complaint against the FCC. And they said this, acting through the Federal Communications Commission, the administration has waged a retaliatory campaign against ABC for a single reason. It disapproves of what ABC broadcasts. That campaign began in this administration's earliest days and has only intensified since. Again and again, the administration has attacked ABC's speech, the stories its journalists report, and the viewpoints its network programs air. Over time, those attacks have escalated into express demands that ABC be stripped of its broadcast licenses because of its speech. So, John, what happens if this lawsuit brought by Disney fails?
If it fails, the investigation at the FCC would proceed and its licenses are in threat. But what I'd be more concerned about is the chilling effect on other broadcasters and other speakers throughout the ecosystem, where there's a strong message that says, if you're not on the president's side, if you're not spouting the administration's agenda, then we're going to threaten you, we're going to take you off the air, and we're going to do whatever we can to punish you. And this has been a pattern with this administration and several other lawsuits, but thankfully, most of the time, the First Amendment has prevailed over attempts to bully and silence critics in speech they disagree with.
Let's talk to callers now. We'll start with Matt in Dallas, Texas, Democrat. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, Mimi. Thank you, and I'm proud to support C-SPAN. Quick comment and then a question. The comment is, we've seen this movie before. Back in the 1970s, there was they instituted something called the Family Hour, where they tried to tell sitcoms, you had to do your programming a certain way between, I think it was 7 and 9 p.m. And producer Norman Lear took them to court and won because he said the government had no business trying to, regulate the speech. So anyway, here's my question. As your guest rightfully points out, ABC directly owns 8 television stations, but of course they've got all the other affiliates, including, I'm in Dallas, and they're affiliated with Tegna Station, WFAA, Channel 8. So here's my question. How does potentially the lawsuit of ABC against the Federal Communications Commission affect the merger between Sinclair and Tegna, which I believe is currently on hold, because it's also embroiled in a lawsuit, because I think the litigants are rightfully concerned that Sinclair and Tegna merging creates too much concentration of media ownership.
Okay, Matt. And that was earlier this year that the FCC voted to eliminate the cap on television ownership.
That's correct. And the merger between Nexstar and Tegna is on hold because of the antitrust lawsuit brought by a coalition of various states. But I really don't think it's a coincidence, when this merger was more in its planning stages, that it's Nexstar stations that were among the first ones to drop Jimmy Kimmel and the last to bring him back on the air, because they were simply trying to curry favor with this administration. And while it's true, he mentioned before the Family Hour, broadcasters do have different obligations than other forms of media. No one's denying that. But that has never allowed the FCC to attempt to dictate the political content of their editorial choices.
And is your organization against the lifting of those ownership caps?
Yes, I believe that it's unlawful and bad policy.
Why?
It's unlawful because Congress set a cap, a viewership cap of 39%. In other words, any individual owner can't have stations that in total can reach more than 39% of the American public. And Congress set that into law in 2004, taking it out of the FCC's hands. So the idea that the FCC can waive it for a particular transaction or, as it has recently done, vote to eliminate it, I think is just contrary to the law. And I think it's bad policy. I think broadcasting is a unique medium that is inherently local, and it benefits from local control and attending to local interests like local news, emergencies, school closures, and just sort of that sort of content. We've seen that these mergers end up with local journalists being laid off and with more and more news just being produced centrally and beamed out to all these stations, making them essentially no different than a large network like ABC themselves. And I think, frankly, we just need more competition and more diversity in media in the United States, not less.
But their argument is that this gives them economies of scale, so they have more money to spend on local journalism.
It gives them economies of scale, which they save money and which they keep, and it goes to the shareholders. The evidence really does not suggest that they're using this to invest in local communities, which is one of the purposes of local broadcasters.
Sal in New Jersey, Republican. You're on the air, Sal.
How you doing? I just like to say a few things. I believe the freedom of speech is overstated with the news media. They say things. Jimmy Kimmel said a lot of negativity about President Trump. I think that's what caused all these assassination attempts on our president, because of the negative press. They should be held accountable. Going over the line, draw over the line of what they say about the president. They can't. I don't think that's free speech. I don't believe that at all. You almost had him assassinated plenty of times. These crazy people come out of woodwork and wanted to kill him. I mean, what else could you see that proves that it's terrible what the press did to President Trump? I don't agree with nothing. I don't agree with ABC. I don't agree with CNN. All them news media people wanted to say things just for their own benefit and their own agenda to help their ratings, and it didn't work out. And plus, they almost got him killed. That's what I like to say, and somebody should address it.
Okay, go ahead.
Look, I think it's fine, and, we're a free country, and people are free to disagree with the editorial choices of any particular news media outlet. So if you think that ABC or CNN are biased, you're free to not tune in, just as there's lots of conservative talk radio stations, which Brendan Carr is not going after, that advance those points of view. But the fact is, the government has no business trying to correct what it sees as bias in the media. The Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected attempts by states and the federal government to do that. Just in 2024, the Supreme Court held that stated that a state may not interfere with private actors' speech to advance its own vision of ideological balance. It is simply not a permissible thing for the government to do under the First Amendment.
Let's talk to Annie. She's in Texas and on the line for Democrats.
Well, you pretty much address. Thank you, and good morning, actually. You pretty much addressed a lot of what I was going to comment on, but I would like to know, once the Supreme Court makes a ruling, why do we question that? Why do we fight to reverse that, especially when it comes to things like the dismantling of NPR, the PBS, all of these are stations. Even the freedom of speech, so far as even Jimmy Kimmel. It comes down to the money part. If you don't want to watch Jimmy Kimmel, you don't like what he says, you're free to scroll on and move on. And if enough people agree with you, he's going to go off the air naturally, because he's not going to be profitable to them. So I'm really concerned that the United States government has gotten itself involved in the decisions of what we can say, what we can do, where we can go, and how we can be. And that, to me, screams all kinds of things that we have fought to protect.
All right, Annie.
And that.
Well, those are some great points, and I think that this administration really has been pushing the legal boundaries, not just in this case, but in others. The FTC has been going after medical organizations challenged because it disagrees with their medical advice. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's a strong Trump ally, has gone after Media Matters. And in both of those cases, though, the courts have, in fact, stepped in to quash these investigations. I think even, yes, you're completely right. We think we have settled First Amendment law, and we think we know what freedom of speech means, but you have to keep fighting because people are going to keep trying to control the media and to control speech for their own interests.
Frank in Florida, line for Republicans. You're on with John Bergmayer.
Yeah, how are you? Yeah, I'd just like to mention that during the time when 25 million illegal aliens were in this country, yelling and screaming in the streets, all these protests and all this freedom of speech, bashing Trump on a continuous basis on MSNBC, CNN, ABC, even C-SPAN, never a good word, never even congratulating him on any projects that he has done or trying to improve the United States or, even overseas. Is there anything that Donald Trump can do to get your approval, or is it always bashing? And even to say that we're losing the war with Iran is like, that's freedom of speech. Are you working with the enemy? I mean, are we trying to encourage Iran to continue to hold on until Donald Trump is out of office? Come on. I mean, this is ridiculous. All right. I just wanted to say freedom of speech is one thing, but you cannot there's certain limits on what you can say and what you can do. That's all I can say.
What do you think?
Well, I think there are lots of pro-Trump voices out there. I think we're in no shortage of them. It doesn't mean that everyone has to agree on every issue, and I think that's what makes America such a great and diverse country, is that you have these different points of view. But I would like to point out that there have been many conservatives and conservative organizations that have come out in support of ABC in this matter against the Trump administration. Notably, Senator Ted Cruz has criticized Brendan Carr's mafioso tactics. And he said that his dangerous as hell is what he's doing. Senator John Kennedy recently said that the FCC is getting into the foothills of violating the First Amendment. So I think a lot of principled Republicans and conservatives who might disagree with the specific speech at issue here with ABC have nonetheless saw that it's in their interest in the long term to defend free speech against these sorts of attacks.
Well, I want to bring that up actually because this is Variety. This is from September of last year. It says FCC chairman threatens ABC over Jimmy Kimmel's remarks about Charlie Kirk's killer. And we do have that portion, so we'll just listen to it. This is from an interview with conservative podcaster Benny Johnson last year.
There's a very concerted effort to try to lie to the American people about the nature, as you indicate, of one of the most significant, newsworthy public interest acts that we've seen in a long time. And what appears to be an action by Jimmy Kimmel to play into that narrative that this was somehow a MAGA or Republican motivated person. If that's what happened here with his conduct, that is really, really sick. And I've been very clear. They have a license granted by us at the FCC, and that comes with it an obligation to operate in the public interest. And we can get into some ways that we've been trying to reinvigorate the public interest and some changes that we've seen. But frankly, when you see stuff like this, I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
How did you react to that when you saw that?
I mean, those remarks plainly show that he's objecting to content, to speech, to a joke that was made by a late-night comedian. And that is simply not within the FCC's authority to police.
He said that it is their job to make sure that broadcasters are operating in the public interest. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? How is that defined? Yeah,
the public interest, maybe some people view it as a vague standard, which allows this sort of wiggle room, but it's been interpreted by the FCC to mean, are you serving your community? Are you providing local weather? Are you responding to the community's needs? It has nothing to do with how you're covering, national news events.
Well, some of our callers, as you just heard, believe that criticizing President Trump is not serving the public interest.
Well, I think that the First Amendment just simply disagrees with that. We have free speech, and the FCC does not have the authority to control the editorial choices of private broadcasters, nor should it.
On the line for Democrats, St. Petersburg, Florida. Keith, you're on the air.
Thank you so much. I'd like to compliment the hosts and the professionalism of the hosts dealing with callers who object to one thing or another, and even guests for their strong points of view, like this individual, Bergmayer. The one thing that I don't hear from Mr. Bergmayer is the well-known and well understood partisanship of the media, where they function as political organizations for a political purpose. And that is the concern that the FCC has, that the FCC is licensing people who use the public airwaves for political purposes while posing as journalists, as if they're doing something in the public interest, while they're really partisan, looking to elect partisan political activists like this gentleman, Mr. Bergmayer. He's definitely a partisan apologist for the media. There's nothing coming from his side of the argument that acknowledges all of the negative partisan functioning of the media, and that's a big concern on the part of the public, as your callers have pointed out. And C-SPAN kind of flirted with this issue when Steve Scully was let go and trying to influence debates in a presidential election. So, I mean, I think C-SPAN is...
Yep. Sorry. Did you have something else? Okay, let's get a response on the partisanship.
Yeah, I would not really object to people's point of view that some media is left-leaning and some media is right-leaning. Those are editorial choices that people are allowed to make. I think this notion that everyone has to be perfectly objective and treat every side, it's just an impossible standard. Everyone has a point of view, and media is allowed to have a point of view, just like everyone else is, and that's why we want to have competition, that's why we want to have pluralism in media, and that's why things like the FCC lifting the broadcast cap and allowing higher and higher degrees of concentration, that just limits the number of voices. So if you want to have more fairness in media, you need to have more voices so that different competing points of view can cancel each other out and debate each other, instead of trying to have just a monolith that's somehow perfectly neutral all the time, because I think that's frankly impossible.
James, Madison, Wisconsin, Independent Line, you're on the air.
Hey, I'd like to make a comment about the gentleman that said that heard people criticize Trump and then people try to assassinate him because of criticizing. I don't think that's true. I mean, what do you feel about the January 6th people claiming on the walls saying hang Pence, hang Pence? I didn't hear him mention anything about that. And the other thing is, why can Trump say anything he wants to? Like call Elizabeth Warren, Pocahontas, Little Rocket Man for why is he the one that's got the free speech, all of the speech he wants, and calling people Democrats and communists? I mean, that's false. That's fake there. I mean, if you want to watch a partisan newscast, watch Newsmax once. Jesus, every Democrat there is a communist. So,
any response to that?
Free speech could be messy, free speech could be ugly, and since the founding of the United States has involved a lot of name calling, I'm certainly not going to defend any instance of it, but I think, that's what happens when you have free speech and you have people free to speak their minds. Sometimes people are going to say things you disagree with in a way that you disagree with, but still we need to allow it because that's how democracy works.
And another James, this time in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Democrat. Good morning, James.
Humor. You can't take a joke. There's a long history of political cartoonists, memes. I don't know. Go back to World War II, and how many jokes are told about Hitler. I mean, what the Republicans did? What did they do when they talk about Sleepy Joe? Guess what? There's some truth to that. When you talked about Pocahontas, as your previous caller just mentioned, there's some truth to that. A good joke has some truth to it. What we're really dealing with here is you can't take a joke. I mean, if you looked at some of these things and you said, well, that's horrible, but it's still funny. there might be a different viewpoint on where we're at these days. And it's both sides that are using humor as a tool. And that's historically, that's what we do. That's correspondence. That's political cartoonism. That's something that's always existed. It's nothing new. Yes,
Okay.
we're living at a time right now where we're really kind of divided. But maybe that just makes the joke a little better.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of humor myself.
All right, one more call for you. This is Arthur in Washington, D.C., Independent Line. Go ahead, Arthur.
Hey, good morning. Good morning. Thank you. I was just thinking that the Constitution, all of the amendments were ratified before digital interfaces. Technology is very new. So this is an opportunity for us to rediscover some founding principles for assets like AI and integrate this into the social fabric for our future generations to insulate us and make distinctions between opinion and law. And that's my only comment today. Thank you.
Last comment, John, on anything on AI that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the First Amendment and free speech look like in different media with new technology is always going to change. But I think the basic principle that we need to allow people to speak their mind without being punished by the government for it is timeless.
And what's the timeline for this suit, this ABC suit against the FCC?
I don't know. I don't know the exact timeline. They just filed it. They just assigned a judge. I don't know, and it's all completely unprecedented. I mean, the early license renewal is a completely unprecedented process at the FCC. They could act at any time, which is why ABC went to the court. But they're looking for a preliminary injunction, I believe, or a temporary restraining order, which is sort of like a quick relief, and maybe a trial will happen in the coming months.
All right, that's John Bergmayer. He is legal director at Public Knowledge. You can find them at publicknowledge.org. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up next, more of your phone calls in open forum. Start calling in now. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. And Independents, 202-748-8002. We'll be right back.